Well, good morning. Good to have every one of you here today. I trust that you have been enjoying this series, and if you're new to Gateway, perhaps this has been the first few times that you have been perhaps visiting with us or a guest of your friends. I trust that this has been a helpful for you, an intriguing dialogue, if you would. I hope that there has been some wrestling. I hope that there's been some struggle a little bit, some challenge. Hopefully you're in one of our home groups. We've to continue on in the conversation. We have some 34 groups that were started with this Starting Point series. Well over 250 people, both here and in the Komoka area, youth and young adults. And so we trust that you are having continual conversations throughout the week as we talk about starting point. The premise for this series is that faith has a starting point. Everything in life has a starting point. As we said at the very first week, you had a starting point. In fact, some of you were started on purpose. Some of you were started by accident. But regardless, we're glad you got started. And we're glad that you're here today. We're glad that you're considering giving your faith a fresh, new start. We don't typically think about faith as having a starting point, but it's true. For many of us, we grew up in our homes, and our parents gave us a measure of faith. Somebody prayed for us, or they instilled something to us by way of a synagogue or a temple or a mosque or a church, and somewhere along the way, you were given a measure or a foundation of faith or a belief in God. And then you grew up, and there was a discrepancy between what you were taught as a child and what you experienced as an adult. And you had questions. And it's not that we chose to abandon our faith, it's just that our faith kind of got lost in the rearview mirror and life kind of moved on and we just kind of put it on a back burner. And once in a while you'd think about it, you'd pull it out and you'd consider it again, and you tried to match up what you knew as a child and match it against your experiences, and some of it would work and some of it not so much, and you just kind of put it back there and carried on with your life. So in this series, we're asking questions like, what would it look like to start all over? What if you had a brand new beginning? What would it look like to start all over with your faith? And what would a starting point for an adult look like? Because a starting point for an adult is much different than for a child. And you need to catch the framework for each of these messages. So if you haven't got the first two messages, we want to encourage you. You may want to go back, and if you're listening online, don't just watch this one. You want to catch the first two. Download our app or go onto our website, and you can kind of catch up so you can follow the progression of this series of teachings today. Here's another thing that we don't think about when we talk about the starting point of faith, and that is we don't consider that the story of faith has a starting point. Every major faith tradition actually has a story behind it. It has a history to it. Now, let's be honest, most of us are not really interested in history. And our question is not how did it begin or who is the founder of my faith. I mean, most of us could really care less. For most of us, faith kind of begins with, well, it's Sunday, and last Monday, I began asking God for an answer to prayer, and now it's Sunday, and I just want to know, when is that going to get taken care of? I mean, where is God when I need him? I mean, I got a test tomorrow, and I didn't really study a whole lot, but I was told that if I just trust God, so God, like tomorrow's the test, can you just cut me some slack? And pretty please comes to mind in our prayers. How many know what I'm talking about, the pretty please? When Ashley and Gabby were living with us, as growing up as kids, I always knew that the amount of cost to me was in direct proportion to the length of the pretty and the please. And so when they went, Daddy, pretty please, if they held it longer than like a 3 count, I knew that was going to be very expensive. And it's a little bit like that with God, and we come to God and we say our prayers, and we're not sure, but we don't really care about the history. I mean, the Old Testament and some of those old stories, and what is our legacy and our background. We don't really care about that. It's like, God, it was Monday I started praying, tomorrow is another Monday, and I need an answer to prayer. I want to know what God can do for me right now. But today we're going to go back in time, and I want to tie some of the history of our faith and the story of our faith and bring it forward, if you were, to some of the struggles that we have currently today. Some of the struggles and some of the questions that you have today are actually connected to the starting point of the story of faith. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. In fact, the 3 largest faith traditions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, all had the very same starting point for their faith. All three of those big religious traditions believed that there is a single God who created the heavens and the earth, a perfect world, and then when God gave perfect world to humanity, humans started making decisions and they messed the whole thing up. All religions kind of start with that. Now each goes by a different name perhaps, but it's pretty much God and their ideas. All three of the faith traditions, the large faith traditions, believe that the first man on earth was Adam. They all agree on that. The point is that because they have this very similar beginning of a creator God who made the earth, who made it good, who placed Adam and Eve on the earth, and then they kind of mess things up. That's kind of the framework for the beginning of the faith, and you may or may not agree on all of this, but the one thing that we do agree on, and we talked a bit about it last week, is that mankind has messed this world up. Very simply, very basically, God made the world good, man made the world bad. God made everything fantastic, and we've made everything terrible. And we'd rather not take responsibility for what we have done to this earth, so we'd rather blame God. And when it comes to even our own personal responsibility, some of us don't want to think of ourselves as a sinner. We talked about that last week. Most of us would rather consider ourselves as a mistaker, not a sinner. Because a sinner, the word sinner, that's got heavy connotations to it. That's got weight to it. That's kind of got a finality to it. I'm a sinner, and it kind of brings up heaven and hell and brimstone and all those things. And I'm more comfortable with being a mistaker. Mistaker is much more easier because you can correct a mistake, but you can't correct me. I can't correct me. You can't correct you. And so some of us actually find ourselves, we actually plan our mistakes. Some of you are planning your mistakes for this afternoon. It's going to be a nice day out, and some of you have some mistakes in mind. And I'm not no heavy there, but I understand that. And I mean, what do you call somebody who's who plans their mistakes? It's like, are you like a premeditated serial mistaker? I mean, no, the reality is this. We're not mistakers. Mistakes you correct. We're sinners. And there's something more heavy to that, and it's something that we have to come to grips with. There's another thing that all three major faith traditions come together on, and that is they believe that everything centers around a single man, and that God interacted with a single man, and that God began to correct the ills of this world through a personal interaction with man, and how man had messed it up. And so God picks this person, and the person's name is not Jesus. You see, it's a little bit like the little boy who has a Sunday school teacher, and the Sunday school teacher says, what's got 4 legs and a bushy tail and brown and collects nuts. And none of the kids put their hands up, and they just kind of stared at the teacher blank. And the teacher says, no, what's got 4 legs and a brown tail and collects nuts? And nobody answers the teacher, and the teacher can't figure out what's going on. And so one of the kids put their hands up, and they go, teacher, it's Sunday school, and I know the answer is always Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. For those of us who are part of the church, we think the answer is always Jesus. But the reality is, when you go back to the history of the starting point of faith, the person is not Jesus, because Jesus doesn't come into play until the New Testament. The starting point for faith traditions is in the person Abraham. Abraham is where all three traditions come together and have their starting point. Abraham is also where all three world traditions actually have a separation. At Abraham, Islam goes off in one direction and Judaism goes off in another. At Abraham, Christianity later on sprouts its own wings and it goes in its own direction as well. But Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all look back to Abraham as kind of the father or the founder of the beginning of faith. And God began in that process, in that moment, to interact with mankind on a personal level in a strategic way in which to fix all that man had done, the problem of sin and disobedience and corruption in this world. Now, the reason that we want to talk about this today is because there is a conversation that is recorded in the book of Genesis between God and Abraham, and it's in this conversation that regardless of what you believe about the Bible or wherever you are in your faith journey today, it touches on a tension that you have felt, a tension that you have wrestled with, and perhaps you're even wrestling with today, which is this: if there is a God, how are we doing? I mean, where do I stand with God? How do I know where I stand with God? And how do I figure that all out? And so today there's this single statement that I'm going to tell you at the very end, but it's so powerful that I want you to wrestle with it all this week as you consider the restarting of your faith. And remember, Abraham is not just a historical figure, but there is an Abraham and you connection here today aside to this story. Now, for me to get there, let me tell you about something that happened just a couple of weeks ago, and that it helped to create a context for what we're talking about, and that is this. It was on Easter weekend, and it was, I forget whether it was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but it was kind of, we were having our big Easter meal, and Cheryl was doing what Cheryl does best. She was running around after a service, and she was preparing the meal and getting everything put together for that great feast, and I was doing what I do best, laying on the couch watching her. And it was our Easter meal, and as she was kind of going around getting everything ready, and I was sitting there watching her as she's putting everything onto the table. We have this really big water jug, and as she's going back and forth, she goes to put the water jug onto the table, and somehow she misses the table, and the water jug comes off the table, and it hits the ceramic tile on our floor, and it goes off like a bomb. It's just this massive noise, and it shatters, and because it was a cylindrical, kind of a solid piece of glass, when it hits, it explodes, and there's glass everywhere, and I look up from the couch, and there's glass shards all over the floor, and there's water, and Cheryl's standing right in the middle of all of the broken glass, and others of the family, they kind of all looking, and there's this moment as we look at this sea of broken glass, and for a moment we just all sit there because the noise has caught us off guard. Everybody's kind of jumped. And for a quick second, and I'm sure you all know you've had these moments, especially the men. For a quick second, I consider, and I almost say out loud, what'd you do that for? I mean, I'm hungry. I preached hard today. I worked hard today, and I'm hungry. This is delaying the meal. Cheryl, be careful cleaning the floor up. I don't want you cutting yourself and getting blood all over the floor. I mean, and please don't cut yourself real bad, because if you do, you're going to need stitches, and that's going to put a downer on the whole meal, and you're going to have to go to the hospital, and we're going to have to wait. Please. Now, here's the thing, and then I'll move on. Some of you think that's what God's like. Some of you feel that God comes into your life, and something happens, and everything is shattered. And it's like a sea of broken glass. And you think God is just sitting there staring at you going, why'd you do that? How stupid are you? I mean, you are there in your own little sea of broken glass with all the damage, all the consequences for your decisions. And God looks at you and says, what'd you do that for? Hurry and clean it up. I mean, I'm here if you need me, but you know what? You need to get this mess of your broken life all cleaned up, because you got to clean up what you mess up. But that's not what God does. And thankfully, that's not what I did. Being the wise, wonderful husband that I am, I'm sitting on that couch, and while Cheryl is standing there amidst the broken glass, and I pondered those earlier thoughts in my mind, wisdom said that would not be a good thing to say. I put on wisdom and I yell out, nobody move. And I get down on my hands and my knees and I begin to start picking up the shards of glass one piece at a time. I start with the big pieces and then I move on to the smaller ones and even to the very tiniest of pieces. And I went around the floor on my hands and knees picking up each one of them, because no matter how small the little pieces are, even the smallest pieces will do a number on someone's foot. Mankind had so polluted the world that when we think about injustice in our world today, nothing compared to the injustices of the world during the times of Abraham. In the ancient world where there was no law or no civil society, it was survival of the fittest, a time when slavery was commonplace. No one would give a second thought to not having slavery. Kidnapping was commonplace. Murder, rape. If you wanted someone, you took them and you did whatever you wanted to them unless there was someone who was bigger or stronger or meaner to stop you. Life was an eye for an eye, a life for a life, and no one could enforce that on you but you. And into that world, God stares and realizes that sin has taken such a hold on humanity, And if he was a God who cared, and he was a God who cared, God had a decision to make. Do I wade into this mess and try to find a starting point for cleaning up all of this broken glass that someone else has done? Or do I just go over to the big old world and hang an out of order sign on the earth and go and try to do something else somewhere else? He tried that once before, and man still made a mess of it. And all the major faith traditions believe that God decided to wade into the mess of humanity, and that he did by choosing a single man, Abraham, and he started there. So around 1876 BC, God interrupts humanity. He chooses this man, Abraham, as the starting point for fixing the mess that we had made and humanity had made of the earth. And so it's interesting because Abraham was just a normal guy. He wasn't some super righteous guy. In fact, Abraham had some real issues. He was full of all of the sin, not a lot of mistakes. He might have called them mistakes, but Abraham was as much a sinner as you and I today. In fact, there was one time Abraham was actually going through Egypt, and Pharaoh got a look at his wife, who apparently was quite the thing to look at, and he kind of wanted her. And so Pharaoh sends his servants over to Abraham and says, hey, we like that girl. Can I have her? Is she married, or is she with anybody? And Abraham thinks to himself, well, if I tell him I'm married, then he's going to kill me and take her anyways. So I'll just tell him it's my sister. Now, men, how many of you know that if somebody wanted your wife, pawning her off as a sister is not the wise thing to do? That's what Abraham does. Abraham says, no, so Pharaoh, you can have her. She's my sister. So when we talk about Abraham being this great, great character, please understand, Abraham was not some super righteous guy. Abraham had his problems. He had his issues. He was a normal person. But God had to start somewhere, and so he picks imperfect Abraham, and here's what he says to him. He says in Genesis chapter 12, he says, Abraham, I want you to go from your country, go from your family, go from your people. I want you to take all of your father's household, and I want you to go to a land that I'm going to show you. You've never been there. I want you to abandon everything that you know to be normal for you and everything that you know to be right for you. Leave your entire circle of influence. And Abraham, I'm starting over. I'm going to do something brand new. And so I have chosen you to impact and change the world. Now, don't ask me why I've chosen you, Abraham, but I had to start somewhere, so I'm choosing you. And then in this dialogue between God and Abraham, he makes three interesting promises that I want to kind of walk you through. Number one, Abraham is told, I'm going to make you a great nation. He says, Abraham, I have chosen you, and I'm going to make you a great nation. And that, in fact, actually came true. The nation of Israel says, that's it. We're that great nation. You have been chosen us, and so we are going to do that. We're going to make you a great nation. The Arab nation says, no. It wasn't Israel. It was us. We're that great nation. And so the Arab nations all say, it wasn't Israel. Israel wasn't the great nation. We're the great nation. And there's an argument between the two nations to this very day over the Middle East because they each believe that they're the great nation. But the one thing that nobody argues with is that many nations came from the man of Abraham. Now, there's a promise number two. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. The second thing he says was, I'm going to make your name great. So let me ask you today, how many of you knew of the name or the person of Abraham before this service today? How many of you, you've heard about Abraham? Many of you, most of you have already heard of that today. Okay, well, that's great. How about Chedorlaomer? Have you ever heard of King Chedorlaomer? How many? Anybody ever heard of him? Anybody historian? It's interesting because Chedorlaomer was actually the most famous king during Abraham's day. Had more power, more wealth, more anything. He was the greatest man known to the world in that day. Everybody in the day of Abraham knew who Chedorlaomer was, but nobody knew who Abraham was when the promise was first made. So God comes along and he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make you a nation. I'm going to make your name great. And he says to King Chedorlaomer, he says, sorry, you might be famous now, but it won't be too many years down the road and no one will remember your name. And here we are 4,000 years later, halfway around the world, in a different language, in a different culture, and everybody has heard the name of Abraham. So promise number one, I'm going to make you a great nation. It came true. Many great nations. Promise number two, I'll make your name great. 4,000 years of history, everybody knows who Abraham is. Third promise, all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you. He said all the peoples of the earth, not some peoples, not particular kinds of peoples or individuals, but all the peoples of the earth. The world is going to be influenced because of you. Literally, they're going to be better off because of you. And the Muslim nations would say, that's right, that's us. And all the Muslims and all the Muslim nations are better off because of Abraham. And all the Jewish people who ever lived, they say that they've been made richer and better and more successful. They've all been blessed because they are descendants of Abraham. And later on, Christians say, no. He's talking about us. It's about us. To which I think God would say, well, that, of course, you're all right. That's my point. All the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you, Abraham. There's no one in ancient history that even comes close to touching the world the way Abraham did. And it's so interesting that all three major faith traditions all claim he's ours. He's ours. But that's the part of history. Now let's make it a little bit more personal. Abraham's getting older. And God says, I'm going to make a great nation. I'm going to make you great. The world's going to be blessed through you. But now he's an old man and he's got no children. And he realizes that if he ever dies, the inheritance is actually going to go to one of his servants. And he says, okay, God, you've promised that you're going to make me a great nation, but I don't even know what a nation is. That sounds okay, but okay, I'm going to be a great nation. I just want a son. I just want one son to call my own. And he's praying one night, like many of us do when we're praying in desperation. And the word of the Lord comes to Abraham and says this, Eliezer is not going to have to be your heir, but your heir will be a son who is of your own flesh and blood. Genesis chapter 15. In other words, Abraham, don't worry, you're going to have a fresh, an heir of your own flesh and blood son. And then he says to Abraham, I want you to go outside. So Abraham goes out of his tent, he goes outside, and God says to him in Genesis chapter 15, he says, look up at the sky and see if you can count the stars. Now, for those of us who live in the large city, this isn't as meaningful, because if I were to say that to you tonight, you'd go up into the sky and you go, oh, well, there's 5. No, actually, there's 4. That's a plane. It's moving. But you see, in the Middle East, when there's no other lights, when the sun goes down, and if you've had a chance to travel internationally, in other places of the world near the equator and on the other side of the earth, when the night sky comes out, the entire sky is white with stars. And God says, do you see all those stars, Abraham? Count them if you can. But he says, you know what? That's how many descendants you're going to have. That's the kind of impact you're going to have on this earth. Are you listening to me? The writer of Genesis makes a statement. Something that happens in that evening, in that moment, as he's staring at all the stars, and there is something that happens that is so powerful, so significant. It's a personal statement. It's a statement for you and a statement for me. This is a statement that will change your life, and it's amazing that it survives 4,000 years of history, and it's just one statement, but it has such an incredible, profound implication for each and every one of us, because it is in this statement that God, as best we can tell, for the very first time in all of recorded history, for the very first time it is stated the natural or the potential relationship between God and man is established. It is the first moment where God defines the terms of relationship. It's a question that you have asked many times in many ways. Can I know God personally? Can I know where I stand with God? And there's this statement that is so powerful where Christians and Muslims and Jews, they go in all different directions in the answering. But this statement, honestly, none of the 3 major faiths, none of them embrace it wholly and fully without having to add to it, because it is so unbelievable. It is so unbelievably simple. It actually is too good to be true. Are you ready for what it is? Here's what it is. God looks at Abraham, declares the promises, and the Bible says, and Abraham believed the Lord, and God credited it to him as righteousness. Now, you may have read that over 1,000 times. You've heard that phrase before, and it has just kind of gone over your head and went, yeah, okay, whatever. But let me tell you today, this is the defining point, the starting point of faith. This is the hinge of God entering into a personal relationship of something that is spoken further down the road that declares for you and I today how we can know we are right with God. Abraham, it says, believed the Lord. I have no children, but I'm going to have descendants as many and as plentiful as the stars in the heaven. Okay, God, I trust you. And in that moment, in that expression, in that solitary, single expression of faith, the Bible says that God reckoned, or God credited to Abraham a righteous standing with God. In a single moment, in a single expression of faith, God says to Abraham, I am giving you a gift of right standing with me because of your trust. Because of your trust. That little incident in Egypt with your wife, that was just an embarrassing moment. We're going to let that one slide. That whole thing to come with your wife's servant and that whole Ishmael thing, you know what? We're not even going to go there. Abraham, I accept you because you believed and you trusted in me. Trust in God resulted in a right standing with God. I want to say it again. Trusting in God resulted in right standing with God. You can start again today, and all you have to do is trust Him. And when you trust God, God says, you come into right standing with me. Years later, the Jews would miss it. They would say, you know what, right standing with God is by becoming Jewish. You got to get circumcised. You got to convert over. You got to do all the things. We're the sons of Abraham, and so you can be a son of Abraham too, but that's the only way. They added birth to it. Followers of Muhammad, they missed it too. They said, you know what, you got to follow the prophet Muhammad and all of his teachings in the Quran. And then what happens is that your faith will be measured by your works, by Allah, and it's what you do and what you believe. And then it's like minutes after Jesus ascends from the earth, and the Christians, they all start arguing about it too. One says, you know what, you got to keep all of the law of Moses. And the other one says, no, it's about following Paul. And the other one says, no, you got to follow Peter. And then you got to follow the Catholic Church. And then you got to follow the Church of England. And then comes the Reformation. And then all the different denominations. And they're still fighting about it today. Is it birth? Is it behavior? Or is it simply trust? God revealed to Abraham a secret, and it's almost impossible to comprehend that the Most High God would make the standard so simple that all the faiths of the world would mess it all up because it was too good to be true. That in the mess of our making, in the broken glass of our lives, the disobedience that complicates everything, regardless of what you think theologically, regardless of what you believe about sin, the thing that God said, that the key, the formula, the way you enter into a relationship with me, where I call you righteous, where I give you standing, where I call you approved, is not through who you're related to, it's not through your behavior, it is simply by trusting me. Will you trust me? That's what Abraham did. Will you simply say, it's hard to believe. In fact, it's almost impossible to believe. But I'm going to trust, Lord, what you say is true. And so many have missed this because it's so simple. And we hate simple. We say we want simple, we hate simple. We want life complicated because life is complicated. It's complicated because we're the ones breaking the glass. We're the ones that are messing it all up. But God comes along and He says, don't move. Trust me. So let me pick up the pieces. We'll take care of this glass. Right standing with me, just trust me. Trust me, I'll get all the pieces. You know what? You're not going to cut your foot. I'll get it all. I'll get it. Just trust me. You can have right standing in a sea of broken glass of your own making by simply trusting God. So here's a question, and we're going to stop. What if the starting point for a relationship with God is just what I've said? What if it is simply trust? What if all the yeah buts that are going through in your minds, well, yeah, but, and all the people, because I know there's a lot of people that are here smarter than me, and I've maybe made this so simple that you just think I'm kind of dumb and stupid, and you've kind of got this all figured out, and so there's going to be a whole email of yeah buts. Please, Pastor Tim would love to answer them all afternoon. I'm going to be outside in the sunshine and enjoying this nice weather, but if you have all your yeah buts, please send them to him. He would love to spend the afternoon answering them. What if the starting point for you and I as adults is simply to trust God? That he will do what he says he will do. And that when you trust him, he imputes to us right standing. If you'll just believe me, trust me by faith, I will come into your life. And together we'll pick up all the broken pieces. We'll put it all back together again. You're not going to get cut. There won't be any more blood. Because I've already shed it. I've already bled. So you don't have to in your broken glass. What if that's it? And some of you are angry right now. This is hard. It's hard because of what you've been raised with. It's hard because of the preachers and different churches you've attended. It's hard because of what you've read, because of what's been laid on you and all the heavies. There is no other place in the world where you can be unconditionally loved and accepted simply because you trust. God said to Abraham, I declare you righteous because you trust in my promises. What if the starting point of a relationship with God begins with trust? Let's pray. Father, thank you for preserving this ancient text of over 4,000 years so that we can see the beginning point of how you defined relationship, personal relationship. Later on through your Son, Jesus Christ, but it began because you saw the broken glass of humanity and you chose one man, Abraham, not a special person, not a holy person, not a righteous person. He was just common like every one of us. But you made some promises and he actually believed it. Lord, for those who are here today, and they may be standing in the middle of a lot of broken glass, that they could trust you, and in trusting you, they could be in right standing with you. And then you'd get down on your hands and knees, and you'd help pick up the broken pieces. Father, I pray that you would take these words that have been shared today, and I pray that they will wrestle all this week long. What if it simply means I just have to trust God again? Would you inspire faith and hope and trust into our lives again, and help us to shed off the rules and the regulations and the religiosity and all the traditions and all those things that complicate it, and to simply have right standing with you through our trust in you. In Jesus' name, amen.